My name is Kalista, and today I'll be presenting the topic, Swift Sanctions, Financial Isolation as a Tool of Power. We're going to explore some case studies to understand how the global financial system can be used not just for banking, but for international pressure. This topic is especially relevant today as financial infrastructure becomes just as important as military strength or diplomacy in shaping international affairs. So let's begin with a key question to guide this presentation, and that is, how does control over SWIFT access serve as a tool for international political and economic pressure? So while sanctions usually bring to mind images of blocked trade or frozen assets, there is a more technical but equally devastating form of punishment, and that is cutting off a country's access to SWIFT, the global financial messaging system. So without SWIFT, a country is essentially locked out of the world economy. So what even is SWIFT? SWIFT stands for the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. It was established in 1973 and is headquartered in Belgium. SWIFT is a global cooperative that is used by more than 11,000 banks and financial institutions across over 200 countries. So here's how it works. SWIFT provides a standardized and secure way for banks to send payment instructions and transaction confirmations. So you can think of it as a global emailing system, but for banks. So when you wire money internationally, your bank likely sends a SWIFT message to the receiving bank. So a SWIFT code, also called a BIC code, is an 8 to 11 character alphanumeric code that uniquely identifies each bank. So it includes a bank code, a country code, a location code, and a branch code. So for example, JP Morgan Chase in New York might have the code CHES for the bank, US for the country, and then a combination of letters and numbers like 5, 7, A, B, 2 for the location and branch code. So without a SWIFT code or access to the SWIFT network, financial institutions can't easily verify each other's identity to execute global payments. So it is basically a shutdown of cross-border finance. So SWIFT can be transmitted directly between two banks, or it can actually be transmitted through a correspondent bank and then to the receiving bank. So although SWIFT is a neutral Belgian-based organization, it is heavily influenced by the policies of the United States and the European Union. This means that when a country is sanctioned by the US or the EU, it can be pressured into disconnecting certain banks from the SWIFT network. This kind of move doesn't physically block trade, but it freezes out a country financially, and it makes it incredibly difficult to do business internationally, pay for imports, or receive foreign aid. The first major use of SWIFT connection as a political tool happened in 2012 with Iran, but since then it has been used in cases involving Russia, Syria, and North Korea. So moving into our first case study. So in December 2024, as some of you might know, the Assad regime collapsed after more than a decade of civil war. A transitional government composed of opposition leaders took power, and one of their immediate goals was to reestablish access to the global financial system, meaning SWIFT. Under Assad, Syrian banks have been banned from SWIFT as part of broad international sanctions. And these restrictions contributed to a massive economic collapse, made humanitarian aid difficult to deliver, and left millions of civilians without reliable access to food, medicine, or financial services. So in February 2025, the European Union lifted some sanctions on Syria's banking sectors, signaling cautious support for the new leadership, but the United States, however, is holding firm, requiring more democratic reforms before allowing any banking reconnections. And this shows how swift access is being used not only as punishment, but as leverage, so as a way to demand political change through economic pressure. So moving into our second case study, Iran. So in March 2012, Iran's banks were disconnected from SWIFT in response to international concerns about Iran's nuclear program. The impact of this was severe. Iran's oil exports, which accounted for over 80% of its foreign income, dropped completely. The value of the Iranian rial fell, and which is Iran's currency, and inflation rose rapidly. Plus, any international trade came to a halt. But everyday citizens suffered the most from this. They had to experience very high prices, medicine shortages, and job losses. So after Iran's government had to resort to workarounds, bartering, smuggling, and informal currency exchanges, but these were pretty inefficient and damaging to long-term development. The economic pressure was one of the key reasons Iran came to the negotiating table, which led to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA. And this example is often cited as a success story for SWIFT sanctions, isolation that then led to diplomacy. So a quick summary of our findings. What do these two cases show? First, SWIFT is more than a communication platform. It is a gatekeeper to global finance, and denying a country access from it is like unplugging them from the financial grid. Second, financial isolation can have dramatic effects. Just the removal of the SWIFT code can collapse an economy's ability to function internationally. Third, both Syria and Iran show that control over financial infrastructure can shape national policies. Governments may be forced to reform depending on how sanctions are applied and whether alternatives exist. So of course, as always, there are limitations. Some countries are building alternatives to SWIFT. Russia has developed the SPFS system. China has its own, the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, or CIPS. These platforms are still pretty small, but they're gaining some traction. There's also the risk of overuse. So if the US and the EU continue using SWIFT as a tool of punishment, other countries may move away from dollar-based systems entirely, which could reduce Western leverage significantly. And most importantly, there is the human cost. While sanctions are aimed at governments, it is always the regular citizens who suffer, losing jobs, access to banks, or medicine. So to conclude, SWIFT access is a powerful tool in modern geopolitics that honestly isn't spoken about enough. It allows countries to apply pressure in ways that are almost invisible, but deeply impactful, and it affects economies, governments, and most importantly, individual lives. However, it must be used with caution. Weaponizing financial systems can backfire. It can drive the risk of alternatives and deepen divides globally. So I want to leave you with one last question, and that is one that we need to ask. Will control over SWIFT remain a source of Western power, or will the rest of the world need to build a system where that control no longer matters? Thank you so much for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions over you.